Okay, so on this one, and over here we have b squared plus 5 equals 0. Okay, so how do we solve solving x squared or b squared or whatever, and no x to the first power? That's what we're talking about here. We have x squared and no x to the first power, or b squared. So what do? Well, step number 1, get the x squared alone. So our first step is we gotta, we have a wall here of separation, and we have to get x squared alone. So we're gonna subtract 5 from both sides. Boom, boom. And this is b squared is -5, right? 0 minus 5 is -5. We get there so far. So we got the b squared or x squared or whatever alone. Step 2, we're going to put root and plus or minus root over the sides. So we take this b squared equals -5, and we put a square root and a plus or minus square root over the two sides. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, these guys cancel, right? The square root and the second power cancel to just be plain old b. Plain old b. Now, what happens on the other side? It's kind of weird that we have a negative inside of there. Oh, and by the way, you might wonder about the plus or minus. That's because there's going to be two answers. Whenever you have square like that 2, let that remind you there's going to be two answers. And how you get the two answers is the plus or the minus. In my memory device, I say when you put a roof on the house, like a square root, it's like a roof on your house, kind of dorky, sorry. Remember to go up and down, even dorkier. Plus is up and minus is down. Up and down the ladder, right? You can put a roof on your house. You have to go up and down the ladder. That's my dorky saying to help you remember. You've got to put plus or minus whenever you put the roof on the house, because there's going to be two answers. The b squared tells us two answers. Anyway, so we have two answers. We have square root of 5 and negative. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not correct, is it? Let's try that again. We have. Okay, we have. Let's set up again. Square root of -5, comma negative square root of -5. You with me on that? We have plus and minus, right? Plus and minus on the outside, but -5 on the inside of both square roots. So far, so good. We actually have one more step to go. It's like a trick. Let me show you. It's not a trick, but it's kind of a trick. Anyway, everybody's seeing what we're doing thus far. Plus and minus on the outside means plus and minus, but negative on the inside. Now, what is negative on the inside? We need to talk about that for a minute. Negative inside of a root. That's kind of a big deal. What does that mean? Think with me for a second. Think about square roots with me. I'm going to give you a rule, but I don't want it to be some kind of rule. I want it to make sense, because math should make sense. What's the square root of 9? It's 3, isn't it? And why? Like if a younger child asked you, why is the square root of 9 3? What would you say? You'd say, well, because 3 times 3 is 9, right? And that's right. That's exactly the reason. The square root of 9 is 3 because 3 times 3 is 9. In other words, the square root says what times itself is this thing, okay? So by the same logic, what's the square root of -9? Is it -3? No. -3 times -3 is +9, not negative, right? We're trying to do the square root of -9 here. So it's not -3, because -3 times 2 negatives would make a positive, would not go back to -9, would it? You with me? Square root, the answer times itself is supposed to go back to the thing, right? So it can't be -3 because -3 times -3 goes back to +9. 2 negatives make a positive, not -9. So no, that's I'll write a big no. Well, then what is it? What is it? Is it regular 3? No, of course not, because 3 times 3, that's +9 as well. That doesn't go back to -9. What's the deal here? What is it, guys and gals? What's the square root of -9 then? It's not -3. It's not +3. Right?
It's not a real number.
Yes, exactly. Square root of -9 is not a real number. You can't have something times itself come out -9. No way, right? As we can see right here. 2 negatives go back to positive and 2 positives go back to positive. No way you can have the same thing times itself come out negative. You might say, well, yeah, but do 1 negative and 1 positive. Well, that's not the same thing times itself. That's times its opposite. That's not allowed. That's not what square roots are about, as we talked about, right? Right, like back up here, right? The square root asks for the same thing times itself, not times its opposite. That's just not what square root asks for. It says, hey, what number times its very self, not times its opposite, will go back to be 9? Well, there's nothing. There's no real number times its very self that'll go back to -9. It's impossible. Right. It's not real. What do we call something that's not real? Imaginary, right? If you have a not real friend, then you have an imaginary friend, right? So it's imaginary. It's imaginary. You say, well, what? Imaginary? Right. So that's what we do. We take this negative right here and we move it out and we say I square root of 9. And the I stands for imaginary. It sounds like I'm joking around and making stuff up here, doesn't it? But I'm not kidding. So let me go back up here and tell you the rule then after we saw all that. Well, it already says negative inside root. Well, let's say this way, move the negative outside of the root as an I. That's what you do. So in other words, let's go back to our actual question here. We have this and this, right? It's not real, it's imaginary. That's what the I said. So what do? You do exactly what it's saying right there. You take that negative right there and you move that out and say I, and you take that negative right there. Now it's only the negative inside. Notice inside. We're fine with negatives outside. You can have a million of those. We don't care. Negatives outside are fine. Who cares? But negative inside, that's the issue. Move that out and put it right there. So our answers become plus I root 5. There's no longer a negative inside, and negative I root 5. And those are our answers. Negative and positive. Positive, you don't need to write the plus sign. You can just write I root 5, comma, negative I root 5. That's what you do. Whenever you have a negative inside of a root, you can't do that. It's not real. It's imaginary. So your answers are actually imaginary numbers. That's what the I stands for. You have to move the negative outside because, again, we can't have a negative inside the root. It's impossible. It's imaginary. It's not real. So you move it out and you just write I on the outside of the root. So that negative on the inside sends out an I to the front of the root. Negative on the inside sends an I to the front of the root. Everything else just stays put. The 5 still stays inside. The plus and the minus that were already outside are still there. Everything else stays put. I know that seems totally bizarre, but I hope it makes some sense now. It's not a real number, right? You cannot take the square root of a negative number. No number times itself is ever negative. So it's impossible. It's not real. It's imaginary. So when you have a negative inside, negatives outside, we're fine with those. But negatives inside, You move them out and write I. You take that negative and move it out and say imaginary. Negative inside, move it out, imaginary. And there are your two final answers. There we go.